Okay, we're going to take the real challenge in doing a book review for The Black Atlantic by Gilroy and The Red Atlantic by Weaver. And I'll try to touch on The Black Atlantic. I had to have a lot of help from this. Great instructor, did a great job with me. First, he's arguing an interconnectedness of the Black Atlantic. Now, obviously, the Black Atlantic is exactly what it sounds like. The diaspora, the moving of a people from where their homeland is to somewhere else, is what the Black Atlantic is talking about. The Africans taken from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to wherever they went. This Gilroy is proposing that this is a culture unique to itself. Not the indigenous people of Africa have the same culture. That it's not one culture. It's not like the Pan-Africanists say that you're an African in America, or Malcolm X said you're an African in America. Gilroy is proposing that the transatlantic or the Black Atlantic is an entirely independent culture, and that it should be celebrated as such because it is not African culture, and it is a hybrid of many cultures, part of it being European. Now, what that actually creates is a doubleness. Is you're part of it, but then you're not part of it, just like blacks in the United States. We are Americans, we are true Americans, but then at the same time we're on the outside of Americanism looking in. His second argument is that African American culture is really transatlantic in roots in its influences, and it is independent of America. That American themes are not necessarily transatlantic themes. There are thoughts and commonalities amongst the people who have been spread out amongst the lands through transatlantic movement that is unique to that group, as opposed to people who are indigenous of one particular place. And in this book, he critiques nationalism and essentialists by invoking the national identity and myths of race and primordial unified black culture. He feels that one, elitism like W.E.B. Du Bois is just as bad as white supremacy, so he does not support that. And he argues that black intellectuals and activists should acknowledge and embrace the hybridity of the transatlantic black person. So it's in trying to understand it, it is part of the crossing of the Black Atlantic that adds something to this particular culture of what he is calling this hybrid culture. So even for what I'm understanding, if you stay too long in a particular place, or like, okay, our generations are here, we have, even though we have been moved historically to the United States as Americans, that's not necessarily a transatlantic people. If I were to move to Russia, that would make me a transatlantic person. When different authors, Toni Morrison, different people like that, W.B. Du Bois, when he moved, though he was a Pan-Africanist, that was pretty much what he was trying to get across, that there is a group that's not to be celebrated as African and not European, that the transatlantic black is somewhere in the middle. Now, this book was pretty well celebrated and was met by another book by Weaver, Jace Weaver, who wrote a book called The Red Atlantic. And in this book, he is speaking of a lot of our Crosby. If you go back to the Crosby video where we were talking about the Columbian Exchange, the things that came over from Europe, things that came over from the Americas, and that exchange of disease and who benefited from it. But what he's saying is so much of the Atlantic history is told from the European perspective that it is really not known how much influence the Native American had, hence the Red Atlantic. And the story is full of information about maritime, military, celebrity, slavery, that the red man or the Indian had crossed the Atlantic. Pocahontas being one of them, coming as an ambassador. You had many performers. There were Native Americans that fought in the Canadian Army in Egypt, showing a present and a taking of resources and ideas and thoughts. Most importantly, we have to remember that before the Americas, Europe was pretty much resource depleted. And the food and the trade and the land and the riches, North America's influence saved Europe. So it was truly a lot of gifts that came from the Native American, and the Native American, the Red Atlantic, the Native Americans' gifts across the Atlantic Ocean was extremely responsible for the perpetuation of Europe. Here is where the story kind of takes an odd turn. It actually takes an odd turn right out of the gate in the introduction, because Weaver starts out saying that the book was aligned not necessarily to conflict the absence of Native American presence in European tales of Atlantic history, but specifically designed to show that the Native American was as important, if not more important, than the African in transatlantic history, which was really odd. It was like, okay, why was that important? As to where the books could have aligned themselves as other cultures were as important in the formation of the global civilization, or to say in alignment to the argument of the Black Atlantic, the Red Atlantic was ignored as much. It directly made a reference to almost, it was implicit of how dare you put the African information out, as opposed to how dare Europeans for not reporting both cultures in Atlantic history. So both good books to read. I found a great challenge in Gilroy, because his idea of blackness and unity, there is a unified thought, almost like Pan-Africanism, but not. So that may be a double reader, and the undertone of competition, or dare I say race, between Weaver to the Black Atlantic. Two books, the Red Atlantic, the Black Atlantic.